Hey, welcome back to the Purple and Bold podcast from DNR Media and the Daily News Record. And I say welcome back because it's been a little while. This is the start of a new season for us as we look ahead to the 2026 JMU football season. And welcome back, Katie, because she is actually back in Harrisonburg after a little trip to New Orleans for Sunbelt Media Day. We're going to talk a lot about that. And just what to expect, not only from JMU, we'll get into a little bit of like what stood out to her from other teams in the Sun Belt as she got to listen to all the players and coaches around there talk. But to travel over there, not with JMU, but travel there to talk to Billy Napier and company as JMU got there, took the stage. We'll start with that. Napier, we've had our first impressions of him here talking to the media and things and the community in Harrisonburg, but to see him get back on that stage at the Sunbelt Media Days, someplace he's been before, obviously, as Louisiana's head coach, but to see him kind of like take the stage and be back in familiar setting for him. What was, just your impression of seeing him kind of be at the center of everything? Because obviously JMU also being picked to win the Sun Belt is kind of at the center of everything right now. Did it feel comfortable for him to kind of be up there talking to all those familiar faces again?
Yeah, it did. I ended up having my one-on-one interview with him first thing in the morning before he even got on the main stage. So it was nice to get him before he was maybe a little talked out. But even when he got up on the stage and what he had talked about with me beforehand was that, it did kind of feel comfortable for him coming back. And it was it was cool to see how far the conference has grown, but he's still seeing these familiar faces, him and Gil kind of coming in at the same time into their roles back in 2019, and seeing changes within the league. His first year was the first year that they even had on campus conference championship game. So for him, he did seem really comfortable. And I do have to give the Sun Belt praise, at least from a media perspective. I like how media days are run. The last couple of days have been trying to dive into a certain conference's media day to get stuff on a JMU opponent, and everything I can find so far, like 80% of the conversation is not related to football, and it's like irking me just a little bit. At least with what the Sunbelt put out there, they have the media questions in there. So I really do like how Sunbelt Media Day runs their schedule. And for seeing Napier back up there, I was down there for the Sunbelt East their day going on the main stage. It was nice to just have a full day of listening to football conversations and it all kind of being in one place.
Yeah, and the main stage stuff is interesting, but you did hit on like a good point that I'm not sure everybody understands. Like that when you go there, you go all the way to New Orleans. You don't just like sit and listen to them talk on the stage. You were able to get that one-on-one opportunity, ask some questions that maybe are only important to you, or maybe you don't want to put out there for everybody in the world to hear. Like to get to do that with not only Napier but other coaches, other players, things like that. Just how valuable was that for you as you are turning out a ton of content? This is our plug. Go to dnronline.com/sports, read all that content that came from there. But like, just what were those conversations like? And beyond Napier being able to have that one-on-one with him, anybody else kind of jump out to you as like, oh, this is either impressive or I'm going to look forward to what this guy does on the field this year?
Yeah, it was a little crazy for me. I wasn't 100% sure I was going to even be down there up until late in the week before media day. So I ended up having just a few one-on-ones because we just weren't sure if I was going to be there. It would have been way too hard to schedule all of them. So I got to talk to Napier, the players, Amar Thomas and Zach Greenberg, and then also Keith Gill. And it's nice, especially when it's the team that you cover, having those one-on-ones, because you're able to go a little bit more in depth with certain things that, a lot of these other outlets, I mean, I'm sure they'll care and they'll be interested in it, especially, an ODU reporter is probably going to be interested in what I asked Napier the closer that JMU ODU game gets to us. But, for them, that stuff isn't necessarily as important to them now as it is to kind of what we're covering at the DNR. So just being able to, on the main stage, it's only about 30 minutes. They're on the main stage, I think. somewhere, depending on how long a coach can talk, it can go a little bit longer, or a little bit shorter. But there's only so much time when they're up on the main stage, so to have that extra time, and shout out to the communication staff at JMU. They usually work it to where I get a little bit longer of a than the 10-minute grace period that they usually have with coaches. They bump it up for me with the JMU guys, so it's just nice to be able to talk about things a little bit more in depth. I have the story coming out either today or tomorrow with Napier where we talked about the secondary, and we're able to bring up specific players that aren't even at media day with him, but specific players that he sees factoring into the secondary, and how, I brought up with him, the group isn't necessarily this group where you have your corners and you have your safeties. You have guys that can bump in from corner and play at safety. You have guys that can move around to a nickel position. So it was nice to have those kind of conversations one-on-one versus up on the main stage, where it's just one of those things that not everybody in the room is necessarily looking for that information.
Yeah, and the timing of it works out too for obviously you get in there, get to ask some questions, that things that maybe have changed a little bit since the spring when you were out there like basically every day talking to people and observing things. One of those things we could talk about like leads into a whole nother conversation, but like Davi Belfort goes from quarterback to wide receiver, and that affects both of those rooms pretty drastically, I think. Something that we'd heard about since spring football, but like hadn't really had a chance to ask too many questions about like that. How much were you able to kind of uncover about that situation? What that means for we can turn this into a conversation about the quarterback competition in general, but let's start with him at wide receiver. Do we think we're going to see him on the field a lot at wide receiver? Like, what will he bring to that room?
That's another thing, like you said, that's a benefit of those one-on-one conversations. By the time Billy Napier, Amar Thomas, and Zach Greenberg stepped onto the main stage to do their media availability there, I had already talked with Billy Napier about the quarterback battle, what it was looking like, where people were, how they've grown since the spring, what happened with Davi Belfort. I had already asked him that and written a story and turned it in by the time they stepped on the main stage. So I think sometimes there is that confusion of maybe people aren't hearing that question asked because they're listening to the main stage stream. And from my point of view, I've already asked it. I've already turned in the story. It's just not something you're going to hear in front of everybody else because I asked it separately one-on-one at 8 o'clock in the morning. So with Davi Belfort specifically, that was when I was curious to see. Obviously, we know the switch to wide receiver happened. I was curious how it happened, who kind of initiated it. Was it something that was agreed upon? And at first, Napier said it was something that made sense to everybody. I asked him again, like, was it Davi Belfort who approached you? And inevitably, yeah, it was Davi Belfort who approached them. Napier remained very complimentary of what he had done in the quarterback battle himself. And Napier was clear. He was like, if any of those four guys were who we needed to go with on the field to play a game at quarterback, they were comfortable with every single one of them doing it, Davi Belfort included. But when it came to him approaching the coaching staff about playing at wide receiver, they understood kind of where he was coming from, the skill set he brought to the game, and they felt that with his speed and how he can understand the game itself, they just felt that having him on the field in a wide receiver position was something that could benefit them. Will he see the field a ton this year? I don't know. I don't think Napier even knows that at this point. They have some guys that are really good and are in that kind of speedy category that Davi Belfort is in. But Napier said that, looking ahead with 3 years of eligibility remaining for this player, he felt it was a good time for that switch to happen so he could learn the position and really grow in it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting dynamic too because of the way it worked out that we didn't even see a spring game. Like we thought we were going to. We thought we were going to get some idea like, okay, this is how many snaps certain pushed in, or this who took the field first. We only saw J.C. Evans play. So just left that much more mystery about that quarterback battle, which I think possibly led to like it being surprising to some people when he's announced that, or it comes out that he's going to make that switch to wide receiver. But at the same time, you kind of had to realize, like, obviously you're not going to play four quarterbacks, and even just having four in a competition, like, makes the whole way you run practices and things a little unwieldy. So it did make sense, whether it was a surprise or not, to hear which individual it was, maybe like ended up making a change of position. But I guess, was it unexpected at all to you that when you heard that was what they were going to do, the move they were going to make?
I was shocked. Yeah, I was a little shocked, just the move in general, because you look at JMU's roster right now, I think the wide receiver position is a group that is so deep and so strong that I was just kind of shocked that that was maybe the position group that allowed him the best chance to get on the field, given just what JMU already has. But that said, having seen what I did see throughout the spring, and this isn't a knock on Davi Belfort, and I was saying it to someone recently, he did kind of stand out as the odd man out. And again, it's not a knock on his skill. I think he's a very talented athlete. But when you looked at Arrington Maiden, JC Evans, Camden Coleman, they're all taller guys. You know, they kind of stand out size wise compared to Davi Belfort, who is a little bit smaller. And when you match that with what JMU brought in for its offensive line and what we expect the offensive line to look like in the fall, it did seem that maybe Davi Belfort wasn't going to be the best option for JMU at quarterback, given all of the other variables that they had. But that said, it was still just a little bit surprising just because of the depth that they have at wide receiver. But I still think the coaching staff is excited to see what he can add to that room.
Yeah, I mean, the other variable, like you talk about him kind of being the outlier, not just, height, size, and everything. Two of those guys have been with the program. Obviously, it's new coaching staff and everything, but there's at least some tape in there of them practicing, things like that. There's something to go on there. Arrington Maiden played a little bit at Memphis, and Belfort has, a little bit of experience, but it just seems like he probably had the least amount of like actual tape, things you could watch for him, and just maybe that's a little bit of a disadvantage going into that quarterback battle, particularly when Cam Coleman, like, played a lot. He's played a lot of college football. There's all this talk about, like, okay, nobody has FBS level snaps. He's played a lot of college football, so there's at least that. JC Evans has, he'll always be able to say, like, I was, bowl game MVP. Like, no matter what happens the rest of the way at JMU, he's got something there. But also there's a familiar, probably like being from Florida, I think probably for the staff with JC Evans. Just all that to say, like, there were some outliers that kind of made him, if he wasn't the odd man out, like, it did kind of like have some things that would maybe point to that being the case.
Yeah, and I think when you look at, I think what stood out to me in the spring with the quarterback room is they all did present some leadership qualities on the field, and that was something that Napier had said that he was really looking for, was whoever won the job was also going to win the locker room. I think maybe from what I have seen, there are guys that stand out even a little bit more than the others in terms of leadership. And I was actually, down at Media Day, I was talking with Dave Riggert about the quarterbacks, and we both kind of said that, when Camden Coleman kind of demands the respect and the attention almost naturally. It's not even like him outwardly saying, "Hey, I'm the quarterback, respect me." It's just everybody kind of gravitates toward him and they all look up to him. And I think JC Evans has also really taken those steps. And I think for him, that's the benefit of being around Camden Coleman for a year, being around Alonza Barnett for a couple years, even going back to Billy Atkins, who he played with in the Boca Raton Bowl. I think the coaching staff has been very impressed with JC Evans' development in that sense and where he's gotten to in terms of being able to throw the ball. And I think with Arrington Maiden, he's another one that he just has a really good skill set. And so, people have asked who I think is going to be the quarterback. I have no idea. But I've gone back and forth for a while. I said Camden Coleman. I think recently JC Evans has kind of come into that mix a little bit more than he was at the beginning of the year. But I think it's an interesting group to watch heading into the season. And I know there are some people that are saying like, if you say you have 3 quarterbacks, you actually have none, and I don't think that's necessarily the case for JMU. I think they really are happy with their 3 options, and eventually, you know, one is going to separate, and I would actually think from the conversation I had with Billy Napier one-on-one at media day, I do think this is going to be different than maybe what Bob Chesney's staff has presented over the last 2 years, where, everything we saw with Chesney's staff, it was very clear that they were rotating snaps, and, you didn't know who was standing out between Alonzo Barnett and Matthew Sluka, or Alonzo Barnett and Dylan Morris. You just weren't 100% sure because of how much they were rotating. The way Billy Napier presented it to me last week was that eventually these opportunities are going to be narrowed down. You're going to go from 3 guys to 2 guys getting the bulk of the reps, and you're going to go from 2 to, hey, this is our guy and we need him to get the reps that he's going to get. So I just, having talked with him one-on-one, it does sound like there is the potential that we're going to know who the starting quarterback is before the opening game of the season. But at the same time, maybe Billy Napier does do the gamesmanship a little bit and holds off so Liberty doesn't know who the starting quarterback is.
Yeah, I wondered about that too, because thinking back a couple of years ago when they didn't announce Todd Centeio was the starter until they put it on the video board with the starting lineups, and it was just like everybody kind of knew it, but it was there. The gamesmanship was there, and how long it took them to post a roster. I wonder if Napier will do something similar, even if we happen to see in practice who seems to be the clear number one. If there won't necessarily be a depth chart or anything like that.
I will say, I don't think the roster online was anything suspicious. I will say to everybody, from my conversations, the roster was a little bit of a actually coding issue where Napier, and people have noticed this, Napier's staff has their height and weight super specific. And there was an issue with what the website would not allow that at a point. So they did have to go back and forth and figure out how to get that coded properly, from what I've heard. Who knows? Maybe I'm being lied to. But I don't think that was as much of a, hey, this is a secret, than it was a, hey, it's summertime. Our comm staff is a little overwhelmed right now in terms of job switches, and we're trying to figure this out to make sure that we can get these specific heights online.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, not an inside job, I don't think.
Okay. All right. Okay. Beyond that, I am curious. We talk so much about what Napier's had to say about the quarterbacks and things like that. When Zach Greenberg, you talked to him, I'm guessing you asked him about quarterbacks. Given his role in the offensive line, did he shed any light on these guys, or not necessarily telling you who's going to start or anything, but just what do you have to say about the?
He did not shed any light. We ended up actually talking more about the running backs than anything else. We talked a lot about George Pettaway and having him back for another year, but I think Zach Greenberg is pretty media trained at this point, given his age and stops at UNC even before coming to JMU, that I don't think much would have been given away in terms of who's potentially going to be the starting quarterback, but I think he would have probably hit me with the, I'm going to protect whoever's behind me kind of line. But I don't know. That quarterback position will be a fun one. I think we all have different guesses. I think every, thing I've seen on Twitter includes a different guy. I know one the other day that I tweeted about didn't even have Camden Coleman listed and had Davi Belfort listed. So just another year, another quarterback battle at JMU.
Well, since you bring up the running back situation, it's another one of those things. It's so interesting when you'll see a George Pettaway on an all-conference team in certain magazines and things like that, and it makes total sense. And then you may not see him at the top of the depth chart on another one, and it also possibly makes sense. With not knowing so much about people who transferred in, newcomers to that, I tend to kind of go with the known entity. We know what George can do when he's healthy. You see him almost put up 1,000 yards. But what do you think is going to happen with the running back? Are they going to use a lot of guys Are they going to try to find a feature back? Will it be Petaway? Will it be someone else when it comes to running backs?
I think the nature of the position is that they're going to have to use a lot of guys. People are going to be banged up in that position, and you want your guys to have experience. That said, I do think Petaway is going to be the guy that leads the group. I think it could be very similar to what we saw 2 years ago when Petaway was 20 yards shy of that 1,000-yard mark. From what I got from Napier in our conversation is that Petaway has, and you know this from sitting in press conferences with him as well. He's not the loudest guy in the room. He's never going to be the loudest guy. And Napier said that he has really taken steps forward to be a little bit more of a vocal leader, and that Napier can really see that Petaway kind of understands the situation ahead of him, that he feels disrespected last year, but he also understands that this year, this is it for him. Like, this is his last year of college eligibility, and he wants to play as well as he can for JMU in this last year and put it all out there. So I think they're getting a very hungry George Petaway ahead of fall camp, and I think there is a lot of hope that he can return to what he was able to do 2 years ago before, an injury kind of derailed him in 2025, and Wayne Knight broke off for the season that he had. So I think there's a lot of hope in that running back room, and I think there are a lot of guys there that are capable to kind of supplement what George Petaway can bring to a game.
Yeah. Well, anything else JMU specific that kind of came out of media days with your conversations with people? Anything that you think people will look out for when it comes to the Dukes before we talk about the Sun Belt at large?
Keith Gill was excited that JMU made the college football playoff. I saw some people saying that he wasn't. He was. We talked about that one too. That was another one-on-one conversation, so it wasn't on the ESPN Plus broadcast. He was very excited about that. The defense seems ready to go. Like I said, I mentioned it in an article today. Billy Napier seems pretty excited about that group, and that Amar Thomas is really kind of becoming the leader that entire group needs as a whole. The defensive front seems really strong with guys like Amar Thomas, Michael McMullen, Kels Bush. That group seems strong and set. And, Napier said he's really trying to push some of these newcomers to step up and make a difference as well. Someone like a Danny Royster. And I think that secondary is going to be an interesting one to just see who slots in where, corners bouncing into safety, and how that versatility allows JMU to make sure that all of the best players are on the field when they need them to be.
Yeah, something you mentioned off air was, I guess maybe the grin or something that Napier gave you when you talked about, maybe almost being positionless when it comes to the secondary. Nobody's going to necessarily be hamstrung by a label of you're a cornerback and this is all you are or anything like that. Like, just expand a little bit on that nature of that group, and Napier seeming to like that ability to move guys around and like you said, just put the best 4 or 5 defensive backs you need out there.
Yeah, he did. He kind of chuckled when I asked him about that versatility to move anywhere, and he said that when you look at the roster, yes, you're going to have guys that are listed as a corner and as a safety, and he's like, you're looking for height, speed, skill, you're looking for all of those things. But he said when they're evaluating that stuff and looking at high school recruits, guys in the transfer portal, all of those different elements, they're kind of evaluating everybody as positionless, and it's just kind of under the whole umbrella of a defensive back. That's kind of how they evaluate it. And, he said, obviously, when it comes to safety, there's a little bit more to it that they're looking for when they're going to play someone at safety. They're looking for someone who can be a good communicator and someone who can, process the whole defense and what the offense is doing. So he did mention some guys that we're probably going to see move around a little bit. Obviously, the last couple of years, everybody has seen KJ Flo as a nickel behind DJ Barksdale. Billy Napier said that, KJ Flo is someone that's probably going to bounce out and play a little bit more of a true safety role at times this year. Rodri McWilliams, who's a redshirt freshman, they have him listed as well, I just looked. I think they have him listed as a cornerback technically on the roster, and they were like, he's someone that could come in and play nickel instead. So there is a lot of versatility there of how they see guys fitting in, and it was part of that look at how they recruited it to make sure that they had guys that could fit in when they needed them to, because Billy Napier said if someone gets injured, you don't want the next best guy standing next to you on the sidelines. You want him to have already been in playing and understand the game more so than standing next to you all season as the backup.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, the rest of the Sun Belt. Obviously, both the media, the coaches, everybody, for the most part, think, the favorites are JMU in the East, Troy in the West, which would give us a rematch of, last year's championship game. Kind of makes sense why you'd pick those teams, but who else do you like in the conference? And does that change any, like, after going and listening to everybody talk?
Not too much. I really like ODU and I really like Marshall. I think Tony Gibson is a really good coach, and I think he's one that last year during the Jamie Marshall game, we saw the potential of the Marshall lineup, and they've returned a lot of their offensive pieces, including, the preseason conference player of the year and Carlos Del Rio Wilson. I think Gibson is a really good coach that kind of, demands the best out of his players almost naturally, and I think that's going to translate really well for Marshall, and the same with ODU. Ricky Ronnie is, had some up and down times at the Sun Belt level, but I think what we saw last year was a very, very good ODU team. And obviously, they need to replace some really good pieces, including a quarterback, because of Colton Joseph's transfer to Wisconsin. But I would say I'm pretty high on those two. There are some teams that I don't know if I necessarily see them being as good as maybe some people are expecting. I think I'm really curious to watch a Georgia Southern, an Appalachian State, and see if they can kind of take steps forward, or if it's something where the pieces just aren't in place and it's not working out. Because, I think everybody, or not everybody, I think a lot of people expect App State to take a step forward this year under the second year of Dal Loggins, but I don't know. I could see, and I was saying this off air, I could see a world that here in like 6 months, Coastal Carolina ends the year better than Appalachian State does.
Yeah, I think it's a big season for both of those teams you mentioned, App State and Georgia Southern. Just where the expectation is for them to be at or near the top of the East every year, and it hasn't happened here lately. Georgia Southern in particular seems like that program that's always kind of on the verge and can't quite make that big jump. Now you get into, man, what year is it for Clay Helton down there? Long enough that he's
Yeah.
got his program established, and you do kind of wonder what your reaction is going to be if they're not multiple games over 500 this year, where they've been just kind of around 500 for basically his whole
I
tenure.
yeah, I honestly think that heading into the season, I think Clay Helton's seat may be the warmest. Around the Sun Belt, I think that there is some growing frustration among Georgia Southern fans where they're just not happy with where that football team has gotten to. So just looking at the grand scheme of the conference, I think that is one position, one coaching job that, if they do not win early and sustain that success through the season, I think there are going to be some angry people looking for a change.
But I'm with you. When it comes to looking at the East as liking, along with JMU, both Marshall and ODU. I think, ODU obviously took a big step forward as a program last year. And, you do lose Colton Joseph, but then you have his backup look good in the bowl game. And, maybe you put too much emphasis on one game, but I think it does at least, if you're an ODU fan, at least calm your nerves a little bit to know that he produced in that situation. You go in, you beat, a really good South Florida team in a bowl game, and take that momentum into this year after a 10-win season, and really, to talk about that program. I think it probably doesn't get referred to enough that they took 2020 off. Like that they didn't play during the COVID year when basically everybody else did. And I think it did set ODU back a little bit. And now we're kind of starting to see what Ricky Ronnie's program really looks like when he's had time to recover from that and get better recruits. Just establish that, hey, we're going to play some football here, and it matters here, and we can do some things in my offensive system. And long-winded way to say it, just I think ODU is building something there and could probably continue to have the success that we saw last season.
Yeah, and they lost their offensive coordinator too, along with Colton Joseph. But the thing is, they promoted internally, so they had a position coach that has been around that offense already. You have Ricky Ronnie, who's an offensive mind, had been around that. So I don't even think that's going to be too much of an issue of having a new offensive coordinator in place. And like you said, I just think ODU has developed really, really well over the last year or so. And if you look back to the conference race last year, yes, it was JMU and Troy playing in that conference title game. I would honestly say the next best team behind JMU in the Sun Belt was Old Dominion. And the way the divisions work out, you're not going to have Old Dominion and JMU both in the conference title game. So I think it played out the way it did. But I think that those teams were 1-2 last year, and I can see them kind of doing that again this year. And I think ODU too has the benefit of having a good schedule, especially early in the year, where they're playing a lot of Virginia-based games. They're playing good opponents. You'll get maybe the JMU fans' dismay, you're going to have the ODU Virginia Tech matchup, which has the James Franklin Ricky Ronnie connection. They're opening their season against Norfolk State, so it's an in-city rivalry right there. I just think it's a good schedule for them, and I think that they're kind of potentially built to have a good season again this year.
Yeah, and we talked about Marshall a little bit. I like Carlos Del Rio Wilson a lot as their quarterback. I think he's he was the preseason pick for Player of the Year. I think that makes a ton of sense. I think he's electric. I think their offense is going to put up huge numbers. The question is just going to be, are they going to have enough defense to make them a championship contender? If they find some guys like to get a few stops here and there, I think Marshall is going to be a really tough team to beat.
Yeah, like you said about Carlos Del Rio Wilson, watching him in person last year, he's a good quarterback. He's fun to watch. I definitely think by the time JMU was playing Marshall late in the year, he definitely had some bruises and was banged up, but he was just still really, really fun to watch. And I'm excited to see him under Tony Gibson for another year, because I really do think they have something brewing there.
Yeah, and we maybe don't pay as much attention to the teams out west as much, but obviously there's some good storylines there. Arkansas State brings back a lot, but not quarterback Jalen Rayner, who moved on. I think they're probably a contender along with Troy. I'm curious to see what Louisiana Tech can do in the Sun Belt too. And whether programs like Louisiana Monroe can kind of continue to build off, taking steps forward. As a program, obviously the sheer number of wins haven't been there for ULM, but lots of turnover all the time when they're recruiting all those JUCO guys and everything. But are they a team that can maybe disrupt things a little bit? Who knows? I'm just curious to kind of see what happens out west if it's Troy by a landslide, or if some other teams can contend there.
Yeah, I think Brian I almost said Brian Haynes. Wrong Brian Vincent. Wrong football coach, but Brian Vincent, I think, is an amazing coach. I do think it's just the circumstance of being at ULM. Like you said, hopefully this year they have an athletic director now, so he's not playing both roles, which was still the maybe weirdest storyline from last year, was that your head football coach was also your acting athletic director. My favorite storyline, sadly, is no longer in the West. I was a big fan of, and it's not even in the Sun Belt anymore, I was a big fan of the Butch Jones-Charles Huff friendship, and Charles Huff leaving killed that friendship real fast. Well,
now they can drive over and have dinner with each other.
Yeah, it killed the friendship in the sense of we no longer see them interact on the conference call or at media day, where they openly talk about one another and how much they love each other. So that one's disappointing, but I do think that Arkansas State is built to potentially contend, and I feel like we say that every year, is that team is potentially going to get there. But I do think maybe Arkansas State is the one program close enough to Troy where maybe they challenge them a little bit, and could get to that conference title game. But yeah, there are a lot of variables out there, like you mentioned, with Louisiana Tech, and just not really knowing 100% what all is out in the West.
Yeah. Well, that'll just about do it for our return episode here for the Purple and Bold podcast. I'm Shane Metlin here, as always, with Katie Harper, talking JMU sports, very football heavy on this episode, and it'll continue to be going into the fall. But we'll touch on some other topics next week when we do this again. In the meantime, search for DN-R media on all the podcast outlets, YouTube, wherever you listen or watch this. Hit like, subscribe, all that stuff, and thank you for tuning in.